There is a place in the memory of the continent where time does not move the way we have been taught to understand it. Not forward, not in the clean linear procession of cause and consequence that Western minds have assembled into something they call history. In the deep interior of what would one day be called America, time moved in circles, in spirals, in the slow turning of seasons that repeated themselves so faithfully that a man could lose the distinction between this year and 10 years past, between his own life and the life of his grandfather, between the waking world and the country that opens behind the eyes when the body finally surrenders to sleep. This is where our story lives. Not in a particular year, because the year does not matter. It matters only that it was long before the ships came, long before the iron and the alphabet and the God of absolute mercy arrived to transform everything they touched. It matters only that the people who lived here had been living here for so long that the land itself had grown a kind of consciousness shaped by their presence, and they had grown a kind of consciousness shaped by the lands. And the boundary between those two things had become something that no one bothered to examine too carefully. His name, in the language of his people, meant something close to the one who listens at the edge of things. He had been given this name at birth by a grandmother who claimed to have heard it spoken to her in a dream 3 nights before the child arrived, which was the traditional way such things were done. But names given in dreams carry weight that ordinary names do not, because a dream is not merely a dream in this world. A dream is a dispatch from somewhere that has no geographic location, a place adjacent to the living world, pressed up against it like a hand pressed against the inside of a drum, vibrating the membrane without ever breaking through. He had always known that his name was not simply a description, but a prescription, a kind of sentence handed down before he had committed any crime, or perhaps handed down in anticipation of the crime he would eventually commit. He was 23 years old. He was a runner, one of the long-distance messengers who moved between the settlements of his nation, carrying news and objects, and occasionally people's secrets in the leather pouch that never left his body. He was very good at his work. He could run for 2 days without sleeping. He could navigate by the position of stars he had learned to read, the way other men learned to read the faces of their wives. He was, by any reasonable measure, a man whose mind was intact. This is important to establish before the story moves any further. His mind was intact. The village he ran from, on the morning this story truly begins, was his home village, the settlement where he had been born and where his mother still lived in the house his father had built before the fever took him. The village sat on the edge of a great plain that in summer turned a color of gold so deep and saturated it seemed almost aggressive, as though the earth were trying to communicate something too large for subtlety. It was not summer when he left. It was the shoulder season, the time between the last heat and the first real cold, when the air carries a particular quality of light that makes distances appear both sharper and more unreachable simultaneously. The message he carried that morning was a routine one, diplomatic correspondence between his chief and the chief of a settlement called the Red Bluff people, whose territory lay 3 days' run to the north and slightly east. He had made this run before. He knew every landmark, every stream crossing, every stand of trees that marked a transition in the landscape. There was nothing unusual about the morning. There was nothing unusual about the errand. The only unusual thing was that about 6 hours into his run, in a stretch of low hills covered in scrub oak and dry grass, he found himself completely, incredibly, unable to recognize where he was. He had been here 100 times. He knew the pattern of these hills the way he knew the pattern of his own breathing. And yet, the arrangement of things felt wrong in a way he could not articulate, could not point to any single feature and say, "There, that is what has changed." The hills were the same hills. The trees were the same trees. The stream he could hear below him was the same stream. And yet, he stood very still in the way that runners learn to stand still, conserving energy even in stillness, and he listened. The wind moved through the grass and made the sound that wind through grass is always made, which is a sound like whispering in a language you almost understand. He heard nothing extraordinary. He felt the sun on his face and tracked its position and confirmed that he was moving in the correct direction. He had not veered. He had not lost the path. Everything was as it should be. But something in him, something in the oldest and most animal part of his consciousness, the part that does not speak in words, but in the language of sudden cold in the stomach, that part was screaming. He kept running. What else was there to do? He was a messenger. The message had to arrive. The second day brought something he had no framework for. He crested a long ridge in the early morning, the kind of ridge he had crested on this route before, and looked out over the valley below, expecting to see the familiar configuration of land and tree and water. What he saw instead was a settlement. A large one, larger than his home village, larger than the Red Bluff people's settlement, arranged in a pattern he had never seen before. Not the circular arrangement his people preferred, not the linear arrangement of the eastern settlements he had visited, but something else entirely. A pattern that seemed almost random until you looked at it long enough and began to suspect that the randomness was itself a kind of order, obeying rules you had not yet learned to perceive. Smoke rose from it in multiple columns. People moved between the structures. It appeared, by every available evidence, to be a functioning, inhabited place. It should not have existed. He knew this territory. He had run through it dozens of times. There had never been a settlement here. He descended toward it because there was no reason not to, and because the runner's ethic demanded hospitality-seeking when a runner was uncertain, and because, if he was being honest with himself in the way that the truly frightened sometimes compel themselves to be honest, some part of him needed to know that he was not inventing what he was seeing. He reached the perimeter of the settlement and was met not with the usual greeting parties that any village would post for strangers, but with silence. The people he had seen moving through the settlement from above had not disappeared, but they had stopped moving. They stood and regarded him from the distance of perhaps 20 paces, each one of them with an expression he could not read. Not hostility, not welcome. Something that existed in the space between those things, like a note of music that falls between two keys and therefore belongs to neither. An old woman came forward from the group. She was carrying a bowl, which was the gesture of hospitality, and so he waited and accepted the bowl and drank. And the liquid was water, simply water, cold and clear and tasting of the limestone it had traveled through. She spoke to him in a language he did not recognize, not entirely. He recognized perhaps one word in 10, which suggested a distant kinship with his own language, a common ancestor that had diversified over many generations into mutual incomprehensibility. She watched his face as she spoke, and when she had finished, she waited. He told her, in his own language, that he was a runner carrying a message to the Red Bluff people, that he had lost his certainty about the path and had come to the settlement for guidance. She listened to this with the same unreadable expression. Then she smiled, and the smile was the most frightening thing he had seen yet, not because it was cruel or mocking, but because it was the smile of someone who knows something that you have not yet understood and is waiting with great patience for you to catch up. She showed him to a structure at the settlement's center and indicated that he should sleep. It was late afternoon. He should not have been sleeping. He had 2 more days of running before he reached the Red Bluff people's territory. But the exhaustion that had come over him was not ordinary exhaustion. It pressed on his eyelids like stones. It moved through his muscles like warm water. He lay down on the mat she provided and was asleep before he had time to form another coherent thought. The dream that came was not the kind of dream that is merely the brain rearranging the residue of the day. He knew this immediately. The way you know immediately, in certain dreams, that you have crossed into territory where different rules apply. He was standing in the settlement, but the settlement was empty now. All the structures present, but no people, and the light was wrong. A heavy copper light that suggested late afternoon, but felt ancient in some way he could not specify, as though the sun making this light were not the sun he knew, but an older version of it, shining before there were words for what it illuminated. He walked through the empty settlement and came to the center, where there was a post driven into the ground. A tall wooden post he had not noticed when he arrived. Tied to the post was a man. The man's face was turned away from him. He walked around the post to see the face and found that the face was his own, but older, decades older, with the specific devastation of someone who has not slept well for a very long time. His older face looked at him, and its mouth moved, and he could not hear the words, and then the face was not his face, but an absence, a smooth oval of skin where the features should have been, and the absence leaned toward him as though to share a confidence, and he woke up. The settlement was quiet. Outside the structure, the night was full of stars in configurations he recognized and found no comfort in. He lay still for a long time and thought about what he had seen and felt the cold in his stomach that was not cold, and said nothing to no one. In the morning, the old woman brought him food and water and indicated the direction of the Red Bluff people's territory, which was exactly the direction he had been moving. He left without ceremony. He did not look back. Later, he would be unable to say with certainty whether it was because he was afraid to see the settlement again, or because he was afraid to discover that it was not there. He reached the Red Bluff people's settlement on the correct day, which made no mathematical sense given the time he had spent sleeping in the mysterious village. He delivered his message. He ate the food that was offered to him. He slept in the visitor's house, which was a proper structure he had slept in before on previous runs, familiar in every detail. He dreamed of nothing he could remember. He began his return journey the following morning, carrying the reply message, and told himself that everything that had happened on the way north was the product of exhaustion and suggestion, and perhaps something he had eaten in the days before his departure. This was a reasonable explanation. He was a reasonable man. He held the reasonable explanation up to the light of his intelligence and examined it, and found it structurally sound. He chose to believe it. The settlement was there on his return journey, exactly where he had left it. He stood on the ridge and looked down at it for a long time, and the smoke rose from it as it had before, and the people moved through it as they had before. And he understood then that he had known it would be there, had known it with the certainty that precedes understanding rather than following from it, and that this knowing was its own kind of evidence of something he was not yet prepared to name. He did not descend toward the settlement this time. He altered his route, moving along the ridge line and then down through a narrow valley that added perhaps half a day to his journey. He told himself he was simply avoiding the social obligation of another stop, another bowl of strange water, another night's sleep stolen from his schedule. He did not tell himself the real reason. The real reason was the dream. The real reason was the face without features leaning toward him with something it wanted him to hear. He arrived home and delivered the reply message and ate his mother's cooking and said nothing about what he had seen. 2 weeks passed in the ordinary rhythm of village life. He ran 3 shorter routes, local errands, the kind that don't require overnight travel, the kind that keep you on land you have known since childhood. He slept well. He woke feeling like himself. He began, with great relief, the process of forgetting. And then the woman arrived. She came from the direction of the north, traveling alone, which was unusual enough to draw attention. She was perhaps 40 years old, dressed in a style that was not quite his people's style, but close enough to suggest a regional neighbor. She carried nothing that he could see, except a small bundle of what appeared to be dried plants. She came directly to the chief's house and spoke to the chief for a long time in a language that several of the village elders recognized as a dialect spoken far to the north and east. When the conversation was over, the chief summoned the runner, and the runner came, and the chief told him that the woman was looking for a particular settlement, a settlement that appeared on no known map, a settlement that had been reported by several travelers over the past year in different parts of the territory, always in places where no settlement should exist, always there one day and unverifiable the next. The woman's son had visited it and had come home changed. The runner felt the cold in his stomach. He said nothing. The chief said that the woman believed the runner might have seen it, that she had been told by someone, she would not say who, that he was the man to speak to. The runner looked at the woman. The woman looked at him. Her eyes had the quality of deep water, the kind that shows you your reflection very clearly. He walked with her to the edge of the village, and they sat together in the cold grass, and he told her what he had seen. He told her about the settlement, and the old woman, and the bowl of water, and the dream. When he had finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she told him about her son. Her son was a young man, younger than the runner, a weaver by trade, not a traveler or a runner, a man who rarely went beyond the familiar perimeter of his home territory. He had gone north to visit a relative, and had returned after what should have been a journey of 4 days, but had been gone for 12, with no explanation for the missing time, no memory he could account for, only a dream he could not stop having, every night since his return. A dream in which he was standing in a clearing, and there was a post in the center of the clearing, and tied to the post was a man whose face he could not see. The runner said nothing for a moment. The wind moved through the grass. Then he said, very quietly, that in his dream the face had been visible. She asked what the face looked like. He said it looked like his own face, but older, emptied of something that he had no word for. She made a sound that was not quite a word, a sound of recognition, of something clicking into place that she had been trying to assemble for a long time. Then she said that the woman in the settlement, the old one who offered the bowl of water, her son had described her also. Her son had described the same unreadable expression, the same smile, patient and terrible, the same indication to sleep. She said this as though she were reciting evidence rather than sharing grief, and he understood that she had been a long time at this, gathering evidence, and that the gathering had required her to hold her grief at a distance she was not sure she could maintain indefinitely. He asked her what her son was like now, after the visit. She looked at the horizon for a moment. "He is present," she said, "but not fully. He eats and works and speaks, but there is a part of him that has remained behind somewhere, a part of his attention that is always directed inward or elsewhere, never quite here." At night, the dream. Every night, the dream of the man tied to the post. And recently, in the last weeks, a new development. He had begun to sleepwalk. He would be found in the morning at the edge of the village or in the forest nearby, standing facing north, as though he had been in the process of walking somewhere and had simply stopped, as though someone had interrupted a command that was still running through him. She had tied a cord around his ankle and attached it to the house post. He didn't resist it. He showed no awareness of it. He simply stood at the length of the cord and faced north and breathed. The runner thought about this for a long time. Then he said that he needed to go back, that he needed to return to the settlement and speak to the old woman again, not to deliver a message, but to ask a question. The woman looked at him with the deep water eyes and asked, what question? He said he did not know yet, but that the question would be clear when he arrived, in the way that certain things are only visible when you are close enough. She asked if she could accompany him. He said yes, before he had thought about it. He said yes the way you say yes to things that have already been decided at a level below the reach of deliberation. They left the next morning. The woman traveled slower than he was accustomed to, but she traveled steadily, without complaint, in the manner of someone who has walked long distances before and has made peace with the pace of things. He found himself grateful for the slowness. It gave him time to think, or more precisely, time to feel the texture of the thinking, the way you can feel the texture of ground through the soles of your feet when you are not running. He noticed things he had never noticed on this route before, not because the things were new, but because he had always passed them too quickly to see. a stand of trees that, from the correct angle, resolved into the silhouette of something he could not name. A rock formation beside the stream crossing that bore, on its western face, markings he could not immediately classify as natural, but could not bring himself to call human either, worn too smooth by weather for certainty. He said nothing about these things to the woman. He was not sure why. On the second night, they camped in the shelter of a long ridge, and he dreamed again. This dream was different. He was not in the settlement. He was underground, in a passage of some kind, moving toward a light that was the precise color and quality of the copper light from the first dream. And he understood as he moved toward it that the light was not coming from an exit, but from something in the passage itself, something ahead that was generating its own illumination. And he knew, in the way you know things in dreams, that whatever was generating the light was also generating the settlement, was also generating the old woman and the bowl and the dream within the dream, that all of these were projections of a single source, the way a fire projects shadows that appear to have independent existence and movement, but are in fact entirely dependent on the fire that makes them. He reached the thing generating the light and found that it had no shape. It was not that it was shapeless, it was that its shape exceeded the capacity of his dream eyes to perceive it. He stood before it for what felt like a very long time, and it did nothing, and he did nothing. And then he woke up, and the ridge was gray with pre-dawn light, and the woman was already awake and watching him. She said, "You dreamed." He said, "Yes." She said, "Was it the man at the post?" He said, "No." He told her what he had seen. She listened without expression, and when he was done, she said that her son, in the early days after his return, had described something similar, not exactly the same, but close, a source of something that was making everything else, that was behind everything else like a hand behind a puppet, and that the feeling of being in the presence of it was not fear exactly, but something more fundamental than fear, something that fear had evolved from. The thing that existed before the animal that experiences fear had developed the capacity to name what it was feeling. He looked at her. He said, "Does your son still dream of that?" She said, "No. He only dreams of the man at the post now." He asked what she thought that meant. She said she thought it meant that her son had moved further in. "Further from what?" he asked. She looked at him steadily. "Further from here," she said. They reached the ridge above the settlement on the morning of the third day. The settlement was there. The smoke, the people, the pattern that was not random. He felt, standing on the ridge, a sensation that he could only describe as recognition running in reverse, the feeling not of encountering something familiar, but of being recognized by something that had been waiting for him, that had known the shape of him before he arrived, the way a hollow in a riverbank knows the shape of water. He stood very still. The woman stood beside him and was silent. After a time, she said, "I can see it." He said, "Yes." She said, "It looks old." He looked at her. She said, "It doesn't look like it was built. It looks like it grew." He looked back at the settlement and understood that this was exactly the right word. Grew. The structures were not quite the right shape for construction. They were the right shape for growth, for the organic insistence of things that are following a pattern laid down in something deeper than architecture. They descended. The people stopped moving and watched them come with the same unreadable quality he remembered. The old woman emerged from the group before they reached the perimeter, moving toward them with the deliberate slowness of a tide. She carried the bowl. Water, again, clear and cold. He accepted it and drank, and passed it to the woman beside him, who held it for a moment and then drank also. The old woman looked at them both with something in her face that might have been satisfaction. Then she turned and walked toward the central structure, and they followed. Because what else was there to do? Because the question he had come to ask was somehow already beginning to answer itself. Inside, the structure was larger than its exterior suggested. He noticed this, but did not remark on it. The old woman sat and indicated that they should sit, and they did, and she began to speak. He understood more of her language this time than he had before, perhaps one word in four, enough to follow the shape of the communication without grasping all of its content, like understanding the outline of a face in low light without being able to read its expression. The woman beside him understood more, perhaps every other word, enough to fill in some of what he missed, and later she would try to translate as completely as she could, though she would say afterward that the translation was imperfect, that some of what the old woman said seemed to shift its meaning depending on how you tried to hold it, like something alive that resists being pinned. What she said, as nearly as they could reconstruct it together afterward, was this. There had always been a place in the world that was not quite in the world, adjacent to it, pressed against it. The place had no location in the way that a village or a mountain has a location, but it could be found if you were the right kind of person, meaning if you were the kind of person whose mind moved in a particular way, whose attention fell on the edges of things rather than their centers, which was why the runner's name meant what it meant, which was why the runner had been directed to this route for his whole working life without anyone choosing to direct him. The place manifested as a settlement, because that was what the mind of its visitors made of it. It took the form of something recognizable in order to be approachable. What it actually was had no form in the recognizable sense. What it actually was had been here before the people had been here, before the animals had been here, before the particular arrangement of land and water that the people called the world had settled into its current configuration. She had been here for a very long time. She did not say how long. She did not eat the food of the settlement. She did not drink the water of the settlement. She drank only the water she offered to visitors, because that water came from somewhere else and went somewhere else, and she was only its carrier, its passage. He asked in his own language, understanding that she understood him, even if she did not speak his language, asked what the water did. She looked at him with the patient, terrible smile, and said something that the woman beside him translated as, "It opens the passage that is already there." Not a passage between places, a passage between states. Between the state of being fully present in one's own life and the state of being aware of what that life is floating in, the way a fish can be aware of the water or unaware of it, and that both states are possible, but you cannot choose which state you are in after you have drunk the water, because choosing requires a self that stands outside the choice, and after you have drunk the water, the self begins to become aware of what it has always been standing inside. He felt the cold then, a great, spreading cold. He understood. He looked at the woman beside him, and she was looking at him, and in her face was the same understanding and the grief beneath it, the grief that had been the reason for her journey. Her son had drunk the water. Her son was not mad, not broken, not sick in any conventional sense. Her son was in the process of becoming aware of what he had always been standing inside, and the awareness was so much larger than ordinary consciousness that the ordinary consciousness could not fully accommodate it and still function as ordinary consciousness. And so the ordinary consciousness was slowly, gently, inexorably being restructured, and the man who had been her son was in the process of becoming something that would eventually bear little resemblance to the person she had raised and loved and worried over and come all this way to find again. And he had drunk the water too. On his first visit, he had drunk the water, and he was here now, returned to the place that had changed him, and the old woman was looking at him with her patient smile, and the question he had come to ask had dissolved because it had been answered before he arrived, or rather it had been revealed to be the wrong question, which is the answer that certain questions always secretly are. He sat with this for what felt like a very long time. Then he asked the only question that remained. He asked if it could be stopped, if the process once begun could be reversed. The old woman looked at him for so long and so steadily that he began to feel the boundary between himself and the looking begin to soften. Then she said something, and the woman beside him translated, and what she said was, "The river does not return to the mountain." That night, sleeping in the settlement for the second time, his dream was quieter than the others. He was standing in a field of long grass in the copper light, and the grass moved around him in all directions as far as he could see, and there was no settlement, and no post, and no face without features. There was only the grass and the light, and the sound of the wind moving through it. The sound like whispering in a language you almost understand. And this time, for the first time, he was almost certain he understood it, almost certain the words were just on the edge of resolving into meaning. And he leaned toward the sound the way you lean toward a fire for warmth, not because you have decided to, but because something in you understands the relationship between cold and heat, and has always understood it, and moves toward the resolution of that understanding automatically, without deliberation, without choice. He woke before the words resolved. He lay in the dark of the structure and listened to the settlement breathe around him. Because it did breathe, he understood this now. In and out, slow as the seasons. The woman beside him was awake also. They looked at the dark above them and did not speak for a long time. Then she asked him if he was afraid. He thought about this question with real care. Then he said, "I am no longer afraid of what I was afraid of before. I am afraid of something I don't have a name for yet." She said, "My son used those words. Not exactly those words, but close. He said, how long before he was the way he is now, standing at the end of the cord, facing north?" She said, 3 months. He was silent for a long time. She said, "I'm sorry. I should not have let you drink." He said, "I had already drunk before you arrived." He said this without bitterness. He said this the way you say things that are simply true, that exist outside the categories of blame and accident. In the morning, they left. The old woman did not come to see them off. They walked south in the early light, the grass silver with frost, the sky the color of a held breath. He ran the return journey in his mind and understood that he was running it for the last time, that the route he had run 100 times would resolve itself into a final run, and that what came after it would not be running, would be something he could not yet see clearly, but could feel the shape of. The way you feel the shape of land in the dark by how your feet respond to it. The woman walked beside him and was quiet. He was grateful for her silence. There are kinds of silence that are empty, and kinds of silence that are full, and hers was full. Full of the love for her son, and the understanding that the love was not a thing that could fix anything, and the dignity of continuing to carry it anyway. He thought about his mother. He thought about the village. He thought about the routes he had run, and the distances covered, and the messages delivered, and how a message is just a thought that one person is trying to move through space into another person's mind, and how strange that is. How strange that we need runners for such things. How strange that the distance between one mind and another requires physical effort to cross. They came down out of the hills into the familiar country 3 days later, and he recognized everything. And the recognition felt different now. Not wrong, not frightening, but layered, as though the familiar surface of things had become translucent, and he could see through it to the layers beneath. The way glacier ice is translucent, and the light that passes through it is transformed by the passage into something blue and ancient. He had not dreamed in the last 2 nights of the journey. He was not sure if this was reassuring. He was not sure reassurance was the right category of response to anything that was happening. At the edge of his home territory, they stopped and faced each other. She said she would go back to her son. He said he hoped the going back was a comfort. She said, "It will be what it is." She said this without despair, which required a courage he recognized and admired. He said he would send word if anything changed, if he discovered anything worth knowing. She looked at him with the deep water eyes and said, "I think we have already discovered everything that can be discovered in words." He knew she was right. He said goodbye. She walked east. He turned south toward home. He ran the last stretch. Of course he did. He was a runner. The body knows its nature, even when the mind is in the process of renegotiating everything else. He ran through the gold grass in the late afternoon light, his feet knowing every rise and depression of the familiar ground. And as he ran, he felt the awareness spreading behind his ordinary awareness, like light spreading behind a screen. And it was not painful, not exactly. And it was not peaceful, not exactly. And the closest he could come to naming it was to say that it felt like being listened to very carefully by something so large that the listening itself was almost indistinguishable from silence. He reached his village as the sun touched the horizon. His mother was outside her house grinding corn in the last of the light. She looked up when she heard his footsteps, and her face did the thing that his mother's face had always done when he returned from a long run. The thing that was not quite relief and not quite joy, but the specific mixture of both that belongs to people who love someone whose life requires disappearing and returning, again and again, always returning until the day they don't. He stopped in front of her, and she looked at his face, and something in her expression shifted. She was a mother. She was a woman who had watched his face for 23 years and knew every variation it was capable of producing. She set down her grinding stone and looked at him for a long moment in the fading light, and then she said quietly, "Come inside and eat." Not asking what was wrong, not asking where he had been or what had happened, just the food and the shelter and the presence, which is the deepest form of knowledge. He went inside. He ate. He sat for a long time in the firelight while she moved around the house doing the small things that people do in houses when the day is ending and the night is beginning. The fire made shadows on the walls, and the shadows moved, and he watched them with the attention of someone who has learned to watch the edges of things, who has always, since before he could understand why, kept his attention on the border between what is visible and what is not. Outside, the plain breathed in the dark, and the stars came out one by one in the vast, cold sky, and the grass whispered in the wind, and somewhere very far away, and also very close, in a direction that has no name in any language, a light that was not quite light continued doing what it had always done, patient as stone, old as silence, waiting with absolute, terrible gentleness for the rest of us to finish being afraid.